connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Hello and welcome to State Circle. I'm Jeff Salkin. Coming up, Congressman John Sarbanes on the Capitol Hill gun control sit-in. But first tonight, another defeat for Baltimore prosecutors. A circuit court judge found Officer Caesar Goodson not guilty in the death of Freddie Gray. What does it mean for future cases? Joining us for analysis are David Jaros, professor of law at the University of Baltimore, and Kenneth Burns, reporter for WYPR Radio. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You were both in court yesterday. Tell me about the atmosphere of that. The judge just doesn't walk in and say not guilty.
No, the courtroom was packed that day. In fact, the courtroom and the overflow room were at capacity for this verdict. And the judge took about 45 minutes to read it. There is no emotion per the rules from the Nero trial, where the judge didn't want to hear any gasp or any sense of emotion. He just wanted to read through his reasoning behind his verdict. And
it becomes apparent if the defendant sitting there and the verdict is at the end of the presentation, I guess.
Well, so the judge really walked through each of the charges, all of the elements of the crime, and so he started with the most serious, the depraved heart murder charge. And I had an angle I could see Officer Goodson. He was stoic. He watched and was really a stone through the whole thing, all the way to the end, showing very little emotion. When the verdict was finally finished, he still remained relatively calm. He had some family members in the audience who did get emotional.
And at the same time, I saw State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. She sat on the center bench directly behind her legal team, and she was lowering her head at times. So you could kind of feel that she was not happy about the outcome.
See which way it was going.
Yeah.
Well, was your sense that any of this was a close call for the judge?
No, I don't think that was the impression he gave. I think it's important to remember this was an extremely hard case to prove. And at the end of the day, I think the judge, as he found, there just wasn't sufficient evidence brought forth from which he could conclude beyond a reasonable doubt each of the elements of the crimes. And at the end of the day, this case became more about a crime of omission, about the failure of the officers to buckle and the failure of the officers to seek medical attention, than it was about that term got a lot of attention.
Well, in different situations, you can be active omission, right?
You absolutely can. The key in this case was really what the defendant's awareness was of the risk to Freddie Gray's health and life, because it was more, if you watched the closing, you might have thought that really it was a battle over the prosecution arguing that Officer Goodson was unreasonable in what he did, and the defense got up there and said, no, he was justified and what he did was appropriate for his safety and for other reasons. And that would have led you to believe that, well, if you decide it was unreasonable, he might be guilty. But the fact of the matter is that the element that was required to be proven was that he was aware of the risk to Freddie Gray's health and life, and that he was conscious when he chose not to buckle or when he chose not to get medical attention, that he was risking Freddie Gray's life. And the judge focused on that in his decision for saying, I couldn't find that beyond a reasonable doubt.
Was there anything that the defense did that won the case, or that the prosecution did or failed to do that lost it for them?
I think for the prosecution, they did not move the needle one way or the other. In the verdict, the judge talked about 5 different scenarios that could happen. And this case really came down to dueling medical examiners and dueling theories. And in particular, Dr. Carol Allen, her credibility was questioned halfway through the trial when one of the lead detectives talked about, she, at least on 3 occasions, talked about this possibly being an accident, but we now know that she ruled it a homicide.
Right. Now, that only came in, that was only admissible because the judge found that the prosecutor should have shared that tidbit with the defense.
Yeah,
right?
there were some complicated issues that grew up that were sort of evidentiary issues that morphed into other issues as it was uncovered that there was potential Brady violations and evidence that wasn't put forward. But I'll go back to what you said before, though, and say even when you step back and look at how the cases were tried on both sides, I think at the end of the day, there was not a strategic failure on the part of the prosecution. There wasn't a witness that they should have called. There wasn't a killer witness brought in by the defense. At the end of the day, there was not sufficient evidence. The video recordings didn't show evidence of the van being driven in a way that with intent to injure Mr. Gray. And so I think there wasn't enough there.
And all 5 medical examiners, the judge found credible. Dr. Morris Soriano, Dr. Allen, Dr. Arden, Dr. Weiner, the judge said they all brought equally plausible scenarios that could have happened.
Now, I will say with regard to the evidence that came out, it was notable, and it was a big dramatic moment in the case. There was a full-on display animosity between the prosecutors and the Detective Taylor, who had been the lead detective, with the state's attorney essentially saying, isn't it true that you were asked to be removed from the case because you were sabotaging the case and the investigation? And in turn, the detective saying you were refusing to look at exculpatory information and turn it over to the defense. It left, I think, everyone with a full understanding of exactly how problematic these kinds of cases are, how hard it is.
I've heard that said, that it's hard to convict a police officer. And I always thought that had something to do with the makeup of a jury and how members of a jury would see it. But this was a judge.
I think there's a range of problems here. On the one hand, yes, I think often, look, if you look across the country, very few of these cases get this far. And when they do get this far, they tend to be tried by judges. And I think there's some belief that judges are particularly sympathetic to police officers. But I think there's also a question about whether officers are willing to really investigate other officers. There is a thin blue line. Officers are unwilling to be witnesses against a fellow officer, and that creates a challenge.
What happens going forward? So the judge, I'm sure, was careful to limit his findings to this particular case. Prosecutors have 4 more, I think, still pending.
We have 4 more trials, and whether or not they are bench trials or not, that remains to be seen. But I wouldn't be surprised if the remaining 4 officers, including Officer William Porter, who faces retrial in September,
who went with a jury initially.
Right. They went with the jury initially. The jury was hung last December. But I wouldn't be surprised if the state's attorney's office continues to pursue these trials, that they all go for a bench trial.
Police union called for her to drop the charges, obviously. I think the Baltimore Sun editorial board did the same. Mm-hmm. What happens there? And if she were to drop the charges, there's a timing question. Do you do that heading into the 4th of July weekend?
Well, you know, there's the political question.
Right.
You know, nothing prevents a prosecutor from deciding they don't want to go forward with the case. I think that it's absolutely clear that they have to reassess what they have. And I think the question they need to ask themselves is not, do we believe a crime occurred, but do we have the evidence that we can bring into court to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Right. We still have Mr. Gray was alive when he went in the van, and he had fatal injuries when he came out.
And I think that's important because the acquittal here was not a finding that even Officer Goodson acted reasonably. It's not a finding that he didn't break policy. It's simply saying that the elements of the crime, that he was aware of the risks he was placing Freddie Gray's life in, that they couldn't establish that beyond a reasonable doubt.
And it doesn't. No, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. It just doesn't mean that an egregious mistake wasn't made.
And it also points to the fact that Mr. Gray's injuries were not necessarily apparent. The judge said it happened internally. It wasn't like a car accident or a shooting or a stabbing where the injuries are physically obvious.
Members of the Gray family, through their attorney, said they were disappointed and that they also hoped that future trials would be televised, which can't happen in Maryland. In your view, would it be a useful thing?
Well, you know, there was, as a law professor...
I know Kenny's a media guy, so I know what he thinks.
He wants in there. Well, I will say, you know, there's a public interest in this case, and I think we want the process to be as transparent as possible. If there were one criticism I'd make of how the trial was conducted, a great deal of the conversations were at the bench with this white noise machine on, and there was a concern about making sure that a jury pool was kept clean if anyone has a jury trial in the future. But I think more of those questions could have been fleshed out in public for all to hear.
And a short amount of time, we could talk for a half hour on this, but reviews of Mrs. Mosby's role as the state's attorney for Baltimore City widely believed that her decision to bring these charges ended the unrest a year ago. but at this point, she's over 3.
She might be 0 for 3, but at the end of the day, I think people will look back at what she tried to do, and they won't necessarily falter, but they won't necessarily forget. I don't think she'll lose her job over this in the next election.
And I just add that I think people need to remember that there are different communities in Baltimore, and they're seeing this case through very different lenses and very different experiences with the police.
David Jaros and Kenneth Burns of WYPR, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. State Circle continues right after this.